This is the Get a Life podcast, X-Cult Conversations.
We have a very special guest on this week's edition of the podcast, coming to us all the way from New Zealand, Mr. Braden Simmons. And he has an extremely interesting history to tell us, and personal history, but he's also going to fill us in a little bit on the antics and activities of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church in New Zealand over the past 10 or 20 years. Maybe starting with the famous election, was it 2005, the Helen Clark election, Braden?
Well, that's the most famous one, Richard. Hello, by the way. Nice to see you again, obviously. That's the most famous one. That's the one where things went most overboard. With the mail-outs that were authorised by people living in vacant properties, and the mail-outs that were authorised by vacant people living in properties, and the subsequent press conference of confession. But of course, there's plenty to unpack, and that is not the election in which the Brethren. They've got a bit of a Russian style, say. I've got, in fact, here's my Team Key T-shirt, a lovely little antique piece I retained from the 2014 election. Yeah. But that was just as a regular citizen, I assure you.
Yeah. So what was the event where the Brethren hired a private investigator to stalk the Prime Minister, and what were the parties involved and their affiliations? I mean, I take it the Brethren are always supporting the right wing, are they, in these political events? Although, of course, they don't support politicians at all.
No. Obviously, see, they believe that government is of God. So it would be lacking in faith to intervene in God's affairs. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm thinking of people that have got integrity. In the 2005 election, now, I don't strictly know who hired the private investigators, but I do know that he probably had my last name. So obviously there was the famous Secret Seven, of which were the gentlemen that took the press conference and cast their bodies.
The Plymouth Brethren, yes.
Yeah, well, there was. So who was it that were involved? So there was my Uncle Miles Wynne, now of Buenos Aires, and there was my Uncle Philip Wynne, his brother. There was Neville, who have long time been, the Simmons boys have long time been bagmen for Sydney in New Zealand, and Greg Mason, Andy Smith, and perhaps one other. So collectively, of course, they arranged the mail outs, the private investigator thing, which, as I understand it, they simply hired PIs to follow around Mr. Davis, I think his name was, the Prime Minister's husband at the time.
And to put that in context,
there were rumours that Mr. Davis was gay, and they thought that if they could prove that would be the political hit of the century, and they'd get their man in power, Mr. Don Brash, instead. It seemed to blow up rather in their faces, it's happened to them a bit, actually, those cousins of mine. So the fact that some bloke had been going through the Prime Minister's rubbish searching for evidence of illicit homosexual affairs, it didn't play that well.
No. And we have to remember that some of our audience is unfamiliar with the Plymouth Brethren Church. So just to kind of sum up what you said, a number of brethren got together, approximately 7, who, as former members ourselves, we know would have been under the direct instruction of Mr. Bruce Hales in Sydney.
Yeah, I think there's no need to say we know they would. there's no need to qualify it. They were.
Okay, they were under the direct instruction of Bruce Hales, who is the leader of the Plymouth Brethren cult, and they hired a private investigator called, was he Wayne Edura, ex-cop, I believe, or ex-security, what's your SIS, is it called in New Zealand?
The Secret Intelligence Service, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
Secret Intelligence Service guy. And he was following around. Basically, he was trying to dig dirt on the left-wing prime minister's husband and any other left-wing politician, with the intent of influencing the result of the election to try and get a right-wing politician into the seat of prime minister and ruling party. Is that the germ of the story?
That's the germ of the story. Yeah. Bruce Hales has got a long history of favouring the right-wing government, but it's not. I mean, I'm a somewhat conservative person. Bruce doesn't. He wants the politicians that he finds he can work with seem mostly to be of a certain grade of somewhat more toxic politicians.
Less
John Key. I like John Key. They're authoritarians, and I think the common theme tends to be that their ideals are for a sort of an authoritarian patriarchal society, not unlike the Brethren. Now that's not something that you can say in public if you're in politics, but it is something you can work towards, and you can accept assistance from that kind of person. I also think that quite a few politicians on the right especially are somewhat, they really are quite naive about who these people are. And they close their eyes perhaps and don't want to know more. But it's easy to not dig too deep.
When there's money flowing away.
Yeah, especially when the money is there.
I mean, it's one of those, one of those excellent moral lessons you can get from horror movies is that if there's a tentacle poking out front of the bed, you don't move the fucking bed. You back slowly out the room.
Unless you're a female octopus.
Yeah, is that if you're a politician and you're getting offered money by the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, frankly, there's 4 tentacles and a severed limb on the floor. And they're like, oh, this is fine. Come join me here.
So what happened was, if I remember rightly, is that days before the election, somehow Wayne, the PI, decides to go public or is outed, somewhat like David Wallace in Canada, and blows this whole thing wide open, again, somewhat like the Klondike Papers. And it actually resulted, almost certainly caused the election to go the opposite way that the Brethren intended. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think the private investigator was the primary driver of that particular disaster. The primary driver of it was that spending 400,000 or maybe more, maybe $1 million, on leaflet drops attacking the Green Party and the Labour Party, which were authorised by individuals living in vacant properties, or as I noted earlier, authorised by vacant individuals not living in their rightful places.
And that was the Brethren behind that.
Well, yes, absolutely. And ultimately, that's not very legal. They had to front up.
So the investigation was
there was a press conference and they all owned up. And Don Brash, he first denied having had, knowing anything about it. And then it kind of came out slowly and awkwardly in the worst possible way that he did know quite a bit about it. And that definitely did hurt him. That was probably not so much, there was a whole toxic mix of a little bit of dishonesty, and a lot of it came out in the worst possible way. So yes, it did give the Labour government a third term, which, I mean, you can't even look at a counterfactual and say this is what would have happened, but you can speculate that it probably did give Labour their third term.
Yeah.
So, like I say, I mean, it's very easy if you're doing things for the wrong way to achieve the opposite thing to what you were trying to achieve.
Yes, exactly.
That does not dissuade my friend Mr. Bruce Hales from continuing to try.
So if you heard that David Wallace, sort of private investigator and political agent extraordinary, had been asked by the Brethren to try and find some way to whip up a scandal to take down the Justin Trudeau Liberal government in Canada, would that surprise you or not?
I would be surprised if it was not true. I'm very, very familiar with the way that these gentlemen conduct their work, and I'm familiar with the personalities at some level over here. I'm not familiar with the personalities at the top of the church in Canada, but Trudeau, he's just the kind of person that Bruce Hales' megalomania would decide that he can get rid of this man. He can get rid of this
sort of
man.
person he would love to hate.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you. That's very interesting. There seems to be a lot of parallels between that New Zealand situation and our more recent experiences here. So can we jump on a little bit in New Zealand history to some more recent news that hit the fan relating to Thompson and Clark? And possibly, I'd forgotten, Cheryl's possibly got a news article she can pop up. We could just look at on that one.
No, Thompson and Clark. Yeah.
So hang on. Well, this is the first thing we were talking about. So this is New Zealand Herald. Brethren dug dirt on Helen Clark.
Yeah. This is Peter David.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is actually Mr. Idor, evidently Labour supporters. This is in 2006. So this is after that election.
Yes.
That he's evidently fronted up.
Yeah.
Just reading some of this out loud. But for the podcast listeners who are listening to the audio, it says Miss Clark, that's the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time, said this week that she had been told by two credible sources the secretive religious sect, that's the Brethren, had sought to have her and Dr. Davis followed by private eyes. Dr. Davis is her husband. She revealed the claim after the Sunday Star Times, an investigative magazine, reported rumours that Dr. Davis was gay. Miss Clark has attacked the rumours as a smear campaign orchestrated by her political opponents and the Brethren. Mr. Idor confirmed the Brethren had sought to uncover information on any illegal activities committed by Labour. That included Miss Clark and Dr. Davis. Mr. Idor also revealed information they had gathered had played a hand in the scandal surrounding Cabinet Minister David Benson Pope's conduct as a former high school teacher and colleague David Parker's former business dealings. Mr. Idor said that he and his colleagues had also collected information on Deputy Prime Minister Michael Cullen. So actually, this is probably a good point to play that video clip from New Zealand Parliament, Cheryl. This is David Parker.
My time as a minister, similar action, in my case, by private investigators who were stupid enough to out themselves on TV. And there's no doubt that those private investigators were being paid for by the exclusive Brethren, following and investigating me, Michael Cullen and David Benson Pope, and probably Peter Davis and the Prime Minister as well. And this was admitted by a private investigator who forgot the word private and did a public interview, which was a silly acknowledgement, but it did show that there are actually intrusions into the civil liberties of me, every other member of Parliament, and every member of the public in New Zealand that are not properly controlled by our current laws.
The most remarkable thing about the first...
That So certainly given the history and of what is known, there's no doubt at all in my mind that a plot to manufacture or find a scandal on Mr. Trudeau would absolutely have been in line with previous activities. No doubt at all.
It's their MO, isn't it? It's their MO. It's how they operate. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's how Bruce Hales operates. It's how he thinks.
Yeah.
He likes to get people into a corner, you see.
Yes, as he said. Yes.
Well, yeah, I'm quoting him. Yeah, I know. But he's very quotable. He likes to talk about himself. And so if you're trying to talk about him, his own, the horse's mouth is as good as any other. He's not the man of God, though. He's just a very intelligent man.
So moving on to more recent New Zealand history, Cheryl, have you got that Thompson and Clark article? We could start with that, and then Braden can fill us in on that one. That would be very interesting.
Hang on.
Yeah. While we wait, obviously Thompson and Clark. It's not. They are a similar firm with founded by gentlemen from a law enforcement / secret intelligence background, but a somewhat particularly controversial one for whatever reason. The government hired them to monitor people in Christchurch. That the Earthquake Commission hired them, and that became a scandal. And of course, then the government passed a blanket ban on hiring them, I believe. But that's
so yeah.
So they're a firm with a history, and
not a good reputation.
Not a reputation as operating, in a altogether ethical way, unfortunately.
Yes. So what was the headline again, Cheryl? You scroll up or down. So this is New Zealand Herald again. Exclusive brethren used Thompson and Clark to spy on former members. And Nikki Hager reports the Exclusive Brethren Church has been using the controversial private investigators Thompson and Clark to spy on former members of the church. Over the past 2 years, Thompson and Clark has conducted hundreds of hours of surveillance on former members who have criticized the cult-like church. The private investigators have watched ex-brethren from cars and parked surveillance vans who have taken photographs of people entering and leaving their homes. And then, just scroll down a bit. Just leave our little section there. Thompson and Clark has continued the same operations for private clients, including the Exclusive Brethren. It has built dossiers on at least 20 ex-members known or believed to be critics of the church. They contain information from monitoring social media, public records, and information gathered from street surveillance, combined with information supplied by the church leadership. So, Braden, tell us about this. What was all this about, please?
Yeah, charming fellows. Well, there's things I do know, things I can speculate on, and things I don't know. Things I do know is that I was one of those individuals. I based that on the fact that I caught the silly bastards following me. They weren't very discreet. Probably on, either they don't have the skills to be discreet, which is possible, or else possibly they were instructed to do it in an intrusive way as possible, which is also possible.
To intimidate you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's quite likely. But so you got these people they wore headpieces and they followed my car on at least one occasion, and I saw what I thought was probably agents on other occasions. Apparently, in fact, I didn't know it at the time, but they were watching my home for 24/7 for perhaps 2 weeks or longer.
And you know the reason? Like, why were they so keen to watch you?
Well, in this case, and I don't like to butter Lance Christie, although I'm sure he would like me to. He was staying at my house. I had made a strategic tactical decision to have the guy. Many of your viewers will know who Lance Christie is. Some in Canada will not. He's a former member of the Brethren from the United Kingdom, a fairly vociferous critic of the church's practices. He's been terribly badly treated. He's one of those individuals that I believe church members were made to sign a commitment to not have any contact with. Now, another person on that list, I believe, was yourself, Mr. Marsh.
I understand that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Christie was being followed extensively around the world, and I wanted to have him to stay at my house because I wanted certain individuals to have to explain to me why this man is the devil, which of course they couldn't and didn't, but they did watch my house while he was there, and possibly since, I don't know. I mean, I am critical not of the church per se, but of the way that it's led. And if you're there's certain patterns of behaviour that I just recently watched, that certain patterns of behaviour that are very common to this kind of entity, if you will. I watched a documentary the other day on the Wirecard scandal, which is a German conglomerate that was just a house of cards in a very similar way, and a Financial Times journalist investigated it, and he was followed by private detectives, and there was all of the same kind of things. And it's the same kind of toolbox that individuals draw on when they've got a lot to lose and a lot to hide, including, of course, in some cases, there's of course there's private investigators, and there's emailing private phone records, and there's all of that kind of thing. It's all very, very similar.
Yeah. Now, talking about private phone records, I mean, as you know, I had the experience that Brad Mitchell sent to David Wallace my wife's itemized phone bill. Well, not the bill, but the phone record, the phone log, even though we don't have itemized phone bills. So it wasn't anything they'd got legitimately by going through our garbage. This must have been obtained from the telecoms company. Do you have any ideas how the Brethren might have obtained that? Do they have any link with telecoms business that they could have leveraged to get that information?
Well, yes. So as you know, so that Tails is increasingly centralized, and it's using that centralization to develop and create its buying power. And of course, UBT's telecom services, which are effectively a block of however many in Canada, it might be 5,000, phone connections and internet connections or some such, that they can all practically direct to a telecoms company, which is a big chunk of customers. And at that level, of course, the telecoms, that's an important customer. And it's very, very easy to once you've got an important customer like that. Bruce Hales is very expert in, the best way you can say it is corrupting people.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I have a suspicion that UBT tend to work with Vodafone in most places. I think it might be Thompson Communications. Is that the name of the company in Canada?
Rogers?
Never mind. Oh, Rogers. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I knew it was some kind of middle-class white bloke's name. It is easy. It's easy to get a single staff member on side, and that information is available. This is why two-factor authentication is not particularly secure by text. I think Rogers Communications themselves have actually had clients hacked that way by compromising two-factor authentication. But so I would suspect, now I don't say that this, I don't know if it's Rogers Communications or who, but I would say there's a staff member there that provided that information at the telecoms company. And I'd say that that's happened in many other places too. It's very scientific. this is an old playbook. This is stuff that Scientology did in the 70s and 80s. And of course, the FBI and the like later, brought them down somewhat. But it's very similar, very familiar.
There's a very interesting little wrinkle in the Klondike Papers, and that is Brad Mitchell also sends to David Wallace some phone log information about a couple of businesses in the United States, which is totally unrelated to my case or anything else. So I asked David, why were you sending this information to Brad Mitchell? And David said, well, I was so impressed by Brad Mitchell's ability to get your wife's phone log. I asked him if he could find some information for some other cases I was working on. And Brad says, yes, no problem, and sends him this stuff. So here's David Wallace, who operates a long way on the shady side of the law, going to the kind of de facto leader of the Plymouth Brethren in Canada as a source for illegal phone log information.
Was Brad Mitchell the source of the phone logs for the journalist that was reporting on the wedding during the COVID lockdown?
Well, we don't know. We don't have a receipt for that. We know that David obtained those phone logs, and we've got the phone logs, but David at the moment is not saying where they came from. So that's an interesting speculation.
I mean, it's startling stuff. But a number of people, it's coming public now, but increasingly, it was clear for a long time that this kind of thing was going on.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we had rumours of it when we were in the Brethren that there was this ability. And we thought that was very cool at the time. I suppose I did, because I was very brainwashed.
And of course, Mr. Hales ministered extensively on, David's Secret Service and all of this kind of thing. He insisted that several people who were those that were, super special, that were up to in the higher classes of Secret Service. They were involved in things that the rest of the community weren't allowed to see.
Yes.
And that's still how it is. I mean, Johnny Average doesn't have a clue. He just kind of bumbles along and doesn't know and doesn't want to know. It's very much like Russia in that way, full of people that are not interested in politics.
Yes, it's safest not to be, isn't it?
Well, not if you don't even want to fall out the 10th floor window, yes. Or you're talking about the prison.
Yes.
I'll just feed you the poison.
Same applies. Yes. So
very much.
Yeah. So,
okay, yeah, go ahead,
Cheryl. Yeah.
Oh no, I just wanted to backtrack for the viewers to kind of give some background information of Braden, of like when he left, why he left, kind of that forefront of his story that got him to where he is now.
Yeah, 100%. Let's get on to your personal.
Yeah, I just want to get more into Braden's story.
Yeah, let's get on with. Let's
I didn't leave. I didn't leave. I just knew that I after very, very many years of trying to find out what kind of a man Bruce Hales was, I learned that he was a cynical and manipulative, a very intelligent man, but not a man of God. And it all flowed from that. Now, my story obviously goes back a long way further than that. The parts that I think might be interesting would be obviously Dr McPhillips in the UK and the suicide ministry, which that goes back to in 2015. I was very unhappy, very unwell, unsure of what the future was supposed to look like.
How old were you then, just for context?
25, I think.
Yeah.
And I went to Germany for a time, arranged by sort of vetted and signed and sealed by Sydney, as those kind of trips are. And while there, I met an individual named Colin Devonish from Salisbury, UK. And Colin wanted me to come with him back to the UK. We had both had a fairly common set of experiences in our pasts with anxiety and OCD, which he had contacts in the UK that had helped him, a professor in particular in the NHS. And of course, mental health is not a topic that's understood in the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. It's not a field that they trust. They don't frequently like psychologists and psychiatrists and psychoanalysts and Freudian instincts and all of those kind of things. It was arranged again with Sydney. I went to Germany. When I got there, Colin told me, for some reason, the professor, the individual he'd wanted me to see, was no longer available. And instead, there was a new person that I would be going to see, a doctor that Colin didn't know at all, and neither did I. One, Dr McPhillips of London. And that was okay. He was expensive. I went to see him a couple of times. It was £400 an hour. And it was a bit curious. The doctor's advice was very much, he explicitly told me that, there's no way you should leave the exclusive brethren in your current state. And he waxed lyrical about the way that all of his many exclusive brethren clients always came with support people. Doubtless, the watchful eyes of the local heavies. But, at the time, I didn't quite think it through this way, but why on earth was a single psychiatrist in the middle of London, a city of 10 million people, seeing all of these exclusive brethren? It was a bit odd. There's, in the UK, the brethren are perhaps 0.001% of the population. Dr. McPhillips told me that he thought that anxiety and OCD were unusually prevalent in the brethren, and he'd like a study to be done on it. And again, why are you in a position to know this? But there we go. That was an interesting set of experiences. While I was there, of course, there was fellowship meetings, that is to say, large community meetings led by Bruce Hales in the United Kingdom, in Sutton. I didn't go, but my host, Colin, and his family did. When Colin came back, he talked to me about, he was worried that my occasional emails to my sister were poisonous, spiritually poisonous, which seemed a bit odd. But I didn't know anything quite what was motivating him. Lindy and I would just periodically send emails checking up on each other. She had, of course, left the brethren, or rather been excommunicated in 2009. So we hadn't, but yeah, it was bizarre. It was truly bizarre. I left the UK, came back to New Zealand. I followed Dr. McPhillips' advice. 6 weeks later, or thereabouts, the white books were published of the ministry, the latest words of the great man himself, in which it turned out that in Sutton, Colin had asked about me, and the fact that I was occasionally emailing my sister, in email contact with my sister who wasn't a brethren. And I think Bruce Hales must have fairly quickly cottoned on as to who was being talked about here, and of course ministered that I would be better to drink rat poison or cyanide. That was how the Germans did it, he seemed to remember. Very historically literate man. I should commit suicide, in short. Which for me, it was, it's fairly extreme stuff to say. It's dangerous. It was something the guy shouldn't have ever said. The church spent quite some time over the next few years. They tried all sorts of tacks to explain it. The most common one was that Bruce didn't know who he was talking about. Which
but he asked in the ministry, in the meeting, he asked what your initials were.
Yes,
and,
but yes, but it was after he'd said all of the suicide-y stuff.
Oh, okay.
which
You
is
spent a whole page saying that.
it's semi-plausible. It's semi-plausible if it wasn't for the fact that the guy then didn't have that transcript edited and published in the White Book in full.
Yeah.
So
and it would also,
if it was merely a case of mistaken identity or didn't know who, well, obviously then why did he publish the whole thing? I mean, it just doesn't stack up at all. It's like
shit like that, right? Who cares who it's about? You shouldn't be those words should not be uttered out of a man of God's mouth.
Well, or anybody's mouth.
No, right? Especially if he knows it's somebody who is struggling. Like, and I mean, this is.
I mean, yeah, I personally wouldn't be able to live with that. He will never know now. There's fairly frequent suicides in the brethren and ex-brethren community. He will never know which of those have been caused by his own words. He'll never know that.
No.
I mean, the question that was asked that triggered all this talk about suicide was specifically about someone who was, I think the words were, in torment with mental illness. So regardless of whether he knew who he was talking about or not, it was completely inappropriate. In fact, if he didn't know who it was, all the more reason not to say something so stupid and dangerous.
Yes, but he does that a lot, and I think it's. I mean, the guys. You look at any of his recent ministries, which I read more now than I ever did when I was in. I think he's suffering from the classic. They call it the dictator trap. And it seems to happen at about 20 years of absolute power. Look at Putin, where they live in such a complete vacuum of authentic human interactions.
Yeah,
their brain doesn't. It doesn't have any kind of idea of the impact of words and what it's like to interact at a normal level. And of course, then they end up doing ever more and more extreme and irrational actions, like invading Ukraine or kidnapping Richard Marsh.
Yes, yeah.
And you know, this
I mean, it's what they call an echo chamber, isn't it? Where everything he says just bounces back to him because he exercises such a terror over the people that he does interact with that the only response he'll ever get from them is to fervently agree with everything he says, because no one dares to disagree with him.
This isn't the first time that this has been said either. So, like, coming from Maple Creek, I have cousins that left, and that's what they were told. There was 2 out of the 3 were told that they were better off dead than to get out into the world. And it's trying to get these viewers to understand when I sit there and I say to myself, people are like, oh no, there would never be a mass suicide in there. There would never be a mass suicide in there. Here, to me, I would not put it past them because of how he talks. And when he's telling people that they're better off dead than leaving out into the world, it's just the way that this man thinks is absolutely so unhuman-like. There's no human compassion and empathy or blood that runs through his brain. I swear his head is completely detached from his body.
I would never say that there would never be a mass suicide in the exclusive brethren, not because it's the underlying patterns. You know, there's all of the superficial stuff. They've got their own culture, their own little background, their own story of who they are. But the underlying patterns of power and control, the hierarchy and the vested interests, the money, the power, it's all very, very similar to the kind of things that motivated people like Jim Jones.
Yes.
Now, it's all well and good when it's well and good. Mm-hmm. Jim Jones's people would have probably said something similar, but then one day an American congressman flew in and was going to investigate Jonestown. And all of the cards began to fall, and that's when it happened. When people are brought to account, when Vladimir Putin's house of cards begins to fall, he might fire a nuclear weapon. You know, he might do that. It's not rational, no, but that's what people do when the cards are coming down. Yeah. So that's when that kind of thing could happen. And what the danger is, it's not what the brethren are now, but it's what their leaders might do if there was another Aberdeen type event.
Yeah, in which we all know that there's so much that's being exposed now, and so many things that are falling. I mean, the amount of people that come through my emails and my phone, just recently, more and more of these types of abuse that are going on, that once enough people get courageous to come forward and start talking, it is very likely that a lot of this will tumble down. And I guess it is one of those things that I do lay awake and think, and like, just hope that if there can be some sort of enough exposure on this, that I would never want my parents to, I just know my parents. I know my parents would follow whatever orders they're given.
Yeah, I think that I guess the acid question is, the acid test is not really whether that such an order like that will ever be given, which, it's still unlikely. But what we can say is that if such an order were given, is a significant number of people would follow it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I think it's important to note too, when you really think about it, Bruce Hales has had absolute control for a lot longer than some of the leaders have had. His father was in control for 13 years. JHS was in control for 16 years, 15 years.
I don't think John Hales had 13 years of power. He might have had 7. He was very much an old man by then, and of course, there's others that will tell you just how much Bruce Hales was pulling the reins. He arranged a deal to help an election program to help John Howard get elected, which was in 1996, without telling John Hales. And after violated his principles, Bruce Hales has pulled the same trick and allowed his Fall Guys to take the blame, and he himself was the white sheep that was completely innocent. He's definitely betrayed and undermined his own father in quite remarkable ways, considering how much he talks about the guy as being such a wonderful man. But that's stepping back. We were talking about
Dr. Phillips.
Sorry?
We were talking about Dr. Phillips.
Dr. McPhillips. Yeah. So the irony is, Dr. McPhillips was telling me that I should never ever leave the Exclusive Brethren, and simultaneously the Exclusive Brethren were telling me that I should kill myself. Which, as you do. But I followed his advice. I didn't have any other advice that I'd paid £400 an hour to obtain, and I figured that I might as well get my money's worth. But what's striking is that in December 2021, I believe, I had, of course, been outside the Brethren for some time, Muhammad Sahel, that's a Facebook account. Whether he's a pseudonym or a devout Muslim convert or a former member of the Brethren Assembly in Mogadishu, I do not know. But he's on Facebook.
I don't know what you're talking about.
No, check it out. He posted a Facebook post. Dr. Mike McPhillips, that's the gentleman. This is Dr. Mike. He practices in London. He has a profitable arrangement with the PBCC cult. The PBCC send its many psychologically distressed members to Dr. Mike. Dr. Mike directs his patients to remain under the PBCC's control. The patients are not made aware of this arrangement. They pay Dr. Mike hundreds of pounds per hour. PBCC members in psychological distress, choose your own medical professional. Now that post, obviously, if we have a look at it, generated lots and lots and lots of comments, including, of course, from myself and others, many telling a very similar story to my own. And that was quite startling. Then in March 2022, 6 months ago or so, there was the news on the Daily Mail and some other sites that Dr. McPhillips had taken his own life. And then that was startling. It turned out that he had hung himself. in public, in a public place. And of course, then there was the recent news following the inquest, which you're looking at now, that somebody had made a complaint to the General Medical Council about him. Now, we don't know, I don't know at least, what that complaint was about. I can guess, and that's had the consequences. He left suicide notes, one of which stated that dead men can't stand trial, and a couple of other things. Now, there's a couple of aspects to what Dr. McPhillips did that I think are very, very interesting, and one of them is the way that he took his life. This is a man that had access to practically every pharmaceutical concoction you can imagine. He was a psychiatrist. He had plenty of ways to take his own life. And I should mention here briefly again that if you're going to be distressed by this kind of topic, please skip this section. But he hung himself, or at least that's what the news initially reported. It was changed later to not mention the method. He hung himself from a bridge in a public place near his home. And why that's interesting is that hanging has got a long and deep symbolic association with the penalty for high crimes, treason, and betrayal. It goes back at least as far as Judas. Of course, that's what Judas did. He purchased a piece of land with the 30 pieces of silver, and he hung himself there. If you go further forward, Oliver Cromwell, the symbolic power of hanging was considered so important that Oliver Cromwell was dug up 3 years after his death by royalist parties. He'd arranged the beheading of King Charles. That's not the current King Charles, naturally. The royalists dug Oliver Cromwell up and hung the body at Tyburn, which is not far from where Dr. McPhillips later hung himself. They did that with a dead body, a rather unhygienic task, but because they wanted the symbolic nature of hanging was seen as important, that Cromwell had betrayed the king and he had to be hung. And Dr. McPhillips was a man that would have known of that kind of symbolic association. Hanging is a very unpleasant way to take one's own life. Doing it in public, even more unpleasant. I don't know why he did it, but it sends a message, whether he meant it to or not, and I find it unlikely he didn't mean it to, that this was an act of, he couldn't face justice, but he felt he had betrayed people and he wanted to make amends or face his just punishment. I could be wrong. I don't know what his suicide notes say. And who knows in the end the mentality of a person acting in this way. But Dr. McPhillips was not out of his mind. He called the police and told them where he was so that they would find his body, rather than a member of the public. He would have known of the symbolism of hanging. And he would have known that there were people like myself who would see it and take that message out of it. So I think it's a remarkable series of events, particularly considering that Bruce Hales told me to commit suicide. And this is what it's led to. I would love to hear from the doctor's family. I suspect that there's part of the background that they don't know. Possibly. They might know it now. I personally feel that he did betray me. And I think it was a very, very, very grave betrayal. I think he's paid the price now, if that's indeed what happened. If that's what he means, he's paid his price now. But it's a very tragic outcome, and it's a shame it had to go that way. But the overarching theme of the story is the way that I think a man like Bruce Hales can corrupt people.
Yeah.
That's a very, very interesting analysis. And of course, one factor in there, which you didn't mention, might be that meeting, their fellowship meeting, as we call it, in Sutton with Bruce Hales, where he spent a whole page talking about suicide and poison, cyanide, and, you know, what the Nazis used in the Holocaust. That was actually published in the Times newspaper, which is like the most prestigious the most prestigious newspaper in the UK. And so no doubt Dr. McPhillips would have, having an interest in the PBCC, no doubt would have read that article, and then he would have been aware, he probably knew who was being spoken about, and he would have been aware of his part in that, of being complicit in that whole system. So it's hard to believe he would have missed that. I mean, it was like a 2-page spread in the Times newspaper.
Oh, there's no way he would have missed that story. I was in touch with Dr. Mike for some time after. I didn't talk with him about the rat poison ministry itself, the suicide ministry, but I did email him a couple of times. And so he definitely would have known that. This is a guy, some of his colleagues had concerns about his links with the Brethren as well, I can disclose. And he was, very much in tune with the community. It would be bizarre if he didn't know.
Yes.
Very bizarre. Now, I'm just going to very briefly grab a power cable because my laptop's running flat. If we can just briefly adjourn for about 30 seconds.
Pause it.
Have we done the have we had a chance?
This meeting is being recorded.
So resuming. I would like to talk briefly about RRT, the Brethren's relatively new public-facing charity. They set it up, as you would know, after the UK nearly withdrew their charitable status for being of no public benefit. And I think it's important to note from a perspective, a neutral perspective, it looks like a very positive move. These people are cooking burgers for people, though, that it is public charity. It's not limited to their own for the first time, and that's all true, and it is good to see. However, it's important to explain why it troubles and upsets those of us who are aware of who and why it was set up. And why the meaning of it is not something that we fully can support. And I'm speaking here as somebody who was deeply uneasy about RRT for a long time, including when I was in the church. And the reason for that is that charity is not about actions in the end, it's about motives. It's about the things that bind a society together. And it's about a genuine desire to help others. In terms of, in its highest sense, charity is the exact opposite of the principle of the doctrine of separation. There is absolutely no point in cooking burgers for people who are damned.
Yeah.
And in days when the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church had a higher level of integrity, they simply acknowledged that, and they did no charity. They discouraged it every which way they could. You would get in trouble. My sister got in trouble for sponsoring some Ethiopian child. That was those resources were supposed to be devoted to the assembly, and that's still their doctrine, and it will always be, because the charity is about the links between people, the bonds and the common purpose, the common star of all humans. That's what charity is. And So RRT is fundamentally hypocritical. And I think the word hypocrisy, as far as I know, was probably coined by Christ himself. He certainly used it in that sense. It was originally a type of actor, I think. Christ used it to describe people who were acting.
Interesting.
And, so there's, Shakespeare coined a few words. Well, from JC did one or two too. And it's interesting that word was, if it was coined by him, well, it's interesting that it describes what RRT is in a very, very, very significant way. It's hypocritical at the deepest level. It is the direct opposite of the underlying principle of the exclusive brethren. If they would hold to at least their principles, that the world is damned, it's corrupted, it's unsavable, and the only way to be saved is to separate from it. That's what underpins all of their doctrines. Well, live it. Live it. And if the world doesn't like it and doesn't give you charitable status, well, that's the price you pay for your ideals sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But Bruce Hales, a man who does not he does not, you could say he's pragmatic, but he's not principled. And it's not something, and I see people I know that are principled in the Brethren, and they're silencing their voices in their heads that must be saying, this is really bloody weird. This is hypocritical. Yeah. Posting these posts about bringing families together for Christmas, and yet they haven't seen their own children for 35 years.
Yeah. And they don't believe in Christmas.
And they don't believe in Christmas. It's incredibly awkward and uncomfortable, and that awkwardness and discomfort means that it's something really, really bad. If you ask me, it's really bad, and I don't know where it's going, but it's not going anywhere good, and hypocrisy never does. Bless you. So that's RRT, and I think so. There's the other troubling aspect of it, which I'm. In RRT's campaigns, it's been impossible to trace the outline of the things that are worrying Bruce Hales, the aspects where he feels vulnerable, and obviously there was a push obviously to work with suicide prevention groups. Which was quite startling considering the ongoing line of coffins that separation produces. But again, hypocrisy is not something that seems to have much meaning. There was a push, obviously, and this is what I'm seeing more and more of, is that they're really focusing on working with police forces.
Yes. And
unfortunately, that is... it's from the perspective of the individuals behind RRT, that's very clever indeed. Police forces have a huge amount of discretion. They just by default, they're by design, but also there's no other way around it. They have a lot of discretion. They get given budgets to prevent wrongdoing, and they decide which wrongdoing matters. And if they are getting a lot of money from one particular entity, well, it's going to be a lot harder to focus too much on that entity and its wrongdoings. And that's exactly what Scientology did, and I believe the Mormons have done also in some smaller parts of the United States, where they tended to live in geographic communities, close, fairly high density communities, and I think Scientology had a lot of close contacts with police forces. They were simultaneously doing a lot of the similar stuff the Brethren are doing. They, you look into they called it the Guardian's office, and it sounds honestly like the kind of place that Brad Mitchell would have worked at. Very much. The Guardian's office operations, you check them out. There was a lady who wrote a book about them in about 1979, and they broke into her house and stole her letter-headed personal notepaper, which people in those days had, so that you could send letters and it would have their own details on it. And then they used that paper to send bomb threats to federal agencies. So it sounded like their critic was trying to threaten the federal government. That eventually got blown up, but the lady had to go through a lot of court cases and trouble over that.
Yeah. So they framed her, in other words. They made her look like a criminal. They had her arrested. Yeah.
Exactly. And the Scientology, they had a concept called fair game, which was those persons that criticised Scientology were fair game, and that meant that there was the only limitations on what could be done to them were the limitations of what the church could or could not get away with.
Wow,
that's what fair game.
So that's a very similar
to official doctrine in Scientology, and you can see it. You know, those of us who have been in the Brethren and know that their attitudes towards non-Brethren, that is exactly how they think.
Yeah,
it's fair game, and the hard limits are what you can get away with.
Yeah. So that's a very similar idea to, in fundamentalist Islamic groups, what they would call a fatwa, as happened to Salman Rushdie, the famous author recently, where they basically say anyone can do what they like to this guy. We're going to look the other way. In fact, we'll scratch your back.
Well, a fatwa is explicitly, it's a little bit different in the sense that a fatwa, they've got different terms and conditions, but they typically say, look, a fatwa is your job. This person must die. So it's every Muslim's responsibility to kill the individual. Which you can at least give that the credit of being having some level of integrity, in that they say, we want to kill you and we are going to try and do that. You can touch and poke that thing and you can see what they're trying to do. You know, there's no deceit. Whereas the concept of fair game, in which, you know, as the Brethren play it with opposers, it's deceit is part of the game. It's it's about doing it in an undercover way and making sure that the proper people and authorities aren't aware of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, they're very clever with how they do it behind the scenes, right? They're very clever. And I think that's one of the things that I try to explain with some of the groups that I'm a part of right now, trying to explain the PBCC, is so many people are so unaware that they hide behind this veneer of just this beautiful Christianity church, right? They don't understand the evil that goes on and behind it and how they cover that evil up.
I think that's a very important point in terms of it explains. So every politician and every person really has got an image of the world that they want, how they want the world to see, and that's what they work towards, right? And from a distance, there's a huge number of particularly conservative, middle-aged white guys, WASPs, as the Americans would call them, who really fall for the vision of society that for the cover of the book labeled Exclusive Brethren. They don't read the book, but they look at the cover and they like it. And that explains, I think, honestly, there's a parade of people that have gotten into bed with the Brethren and they should never have, and it burns them. Dr McPhillips is the latest unfortunate example. I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that he was, a conservatively minded man, probably a Christian at some level. But we had Don Brash, there was John Howard, there was, to my surprise, actually, Stephen Harper. I thought he was a bit smarter than that, but I misjudged him. The George Bush type persons. I think David Cameron is probably a bit more intelligent. But it also extends, of course, to some of these individuals in the legal fraternity. Mr. Gerald Trapure comes to mind. Lovely chap. I connected with him on LinkedIn. Sent him a couple of messages, actually.
Hear back?
He's a profound Christian, right? I thought that we could engage on that level. But it seems that his Christianity doesn't extend to, granting a cup of water to. He didn't reply, no, and he disconnected and then reconnected. I forget. I'm not sure if I asked him whether he arranged the kidnapping or was involved in the meeting arranging the kidnapping. I don't think I did, but he was, of course, very much involved in the whole Brad Mitchell shebang, and he's a devout Christian, and I thought that he would be happy to engage with me. Disappointing, really.
Yes, well, a podcaster in Canada called Jesse Brown, who runs Canadaland, which I think is Canada's top podcast, took David Wallace along this is in the course of making their podcast Ratfucker, which is basically about David Wallace and the Brethren.
So would you just go over the name of that episode again there, Richard? I just missed it.
It's called Ratfucker.
Oh,
that's a word I learned from Cheryl, by the way.
Oh yeah, I assume it's this French influence in Canada. You guys have a dreadful language, honestly.
It's a technical term.
A technical term.
Yes, there's no relation to reproduction at all. So anyway, Jesse Brown, David Wallace, and the cameraman and the team all went along to Gerald Chipper's high-rise offices in the centre of Calgary and said they would like to see him. And this is all on the podcast. You can listen to all this happening. No, they didn't have an appointment, but could they possibly see him anyway? So they all go upstairs and they sit around in his private kind of waiting room outside his, because he's a very top QC, I suppose he's a KC now, whatever they are. He actually has his sort of private waiting area for his clients with free biscuits and coffee and so on.
Where they can review where they can review the legality of their planned kidnappings. Is that what the waiting room is for?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so they all sat around there, the whole team, and they ate all his biscuits and drank all his coffee. But Chipper, strangely enough, was just fully engaged the whole time and didn't emerge from his office.
A curiously reticent man, for one that, he must surely have read the scripture that, you don't hide your light under a bushel.
Well, I think he was hiding under his desk, actually, but...
Or maybe he doesn't have a light. I don't know.
Well, that's entirely possible, yeah.
But he's a classic case in point. How we got onto him is that he's a conservative, middle-aged white guy that thinks that some kind of theocratic republic is, I'm speculating here on what Gerald's own views are, but I'm speaking in general terms here. There are sort of guys that think that some kind of combination of the 1950s England and 1930s Soviet Union is the future. Mostly where they're in charge, and they are very susceptible to the individuals like Bruce Hales and his minions and his money.
Yes,
and it's not the way forward. They're being misled, really. Mr. Chipper isn't going to achieve what he wants to achieve by helping these people kidnap Richard Marsh. He's not going to build the world he wants to see.
No.
And they don't care.
It is. He's been corrupted. I mean, he's
been corrupted, and he's being played, and that's exactly the same with Dr. Michael McPhillips and with Don Brash and with all of these other people. That it's all ended up in the same place, and it will.
And they all end up in the same bin. Yeah.
Well, yeah, technically, a bin potentially in some cases, a coffin in others, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very, very interesting perspective. That is really food for thought. I hadn't really seen it quite like that before, but just the potential of these brethren with their theocracy and their money to corrupt people who may once have been principled or would think of themselves as principled, but the combination of God and money drags them
it is very... Yes, and it is a very much a slippery slope basis. I think Mr. Chipper probably never thought when he first set up that website in 2005, or that whatever it was, where he referred to himself in the third person as Mr. Bruce Hales has set up all of the trusts in his own name on the advice of a leading solicitor, I think the term was. which I suspect is Mr. Chapure referring to himself as a leading solicitor, which is cool, I guess. If it's true, it's true. You can say it. He probably never thought he would end up sitting in a meeting with Brad Mitchell discussing whatever they discussed.
Which was bringing down Justin Trudeau. Yes. Yeah.
You can't pull out. Each step you take leads you in a situation where, I mean, look at what's his name? The guy that was
David Wallace.
The guy that Wallace, yes. So look at what he's had to lose to pull out.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's also true that by this stage, the Brethren have so much dirt on Chapure that if Chapure wanted to pull out, he probably couldn't, because the Brethren could destroy him with what they know about the guy and what they could put out there about him.
Well, yes, and as with David Wallace, and I wouldn't be at all surprised. In fact, I would find it most likely that the situation with Dr. McPhillips was exactly the same.
And you said they even do that with members that get restored back in. I mean, we're in contact with somebody now, and that's exactly, they hold so much over his head that he just can't leave. He wants to leave, but he can't leave. And it is, they tie people in those tangles of getting all the dirt on you, paying off of all your debt, giving that, flaunting all their money, and then making it impossible for anybody to get out of their web.
Yep. I mean, every system of control, high control structure works that way. They love to get, the Russians call it compromat, but it's a familiar system to any. If you look at the USSR, for instance, where they had to build walls on one hand to keep people from leaving. But even to this day in Russia, there's this hierarchy of control leading up to the same individual, and all of all of that control it's coercive control.
Yeah.
And what kind of coercion is used? There's all kinds of coercion. There's financial. There's threats that are illegal in the terms of blackmail and that kind of thing that happens. But a lot of it's just financial and family, and you end up with a structure that's very, very, very unfree, very corrupt, very coercive, and it sits there in plain sight because nobody can. It hides in plain sight because you can't see those ties, you can't see those bonds. They're not there like there's blokes walking around with guns.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting analogy. Talking about the communists having to build walls like the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, because the interesting thing is that the people who lived in those communist countries were told that they had to have the walls to keep the wicked capitalists out. So they were told the wall was for their protection, while of course, in fact, it was to keep them in. And it's exactly the same with the Brethren, that their wall of separation is not actually to keep the world out, it's to keep the Brethren in.
Yeah.
They're retail captive audience, there is captive consumer base.
And it's an important. There's an excellent statement which I was first mooted. First time I heard it was around Donald Trump's first election campaign, and to be fair, it's I'm not sure which way it would go in that context. But the saying is that if you build walls to keep people in, that makes you a slave owner. If you build walls to keep people out, that makes you a property owner. And I think it's important. That is an important distinction.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
that's deep. Yeah.
And another, so that is deep. That brings me to mind of another. This is just going through a couple of sayings that I think are important and relevant to the Brethren, but another one that, of course, is important and deep is, and stepping back to RRT, that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Now, that was said by a French dude a French moral philosopher about 250 years ago. And what it means is that by engaging in hypocrisy, people are admitting that they're aware of that their behaviour is wrong.
Yeah.
If you're going to speak fine words of what you are committed to about bringing families together for Christmas, that is an admission that you were aware that all of the families that you've separated, that is actually wrong.
Yes,
you're aware of it.
Or to put it another way, if the brethren had integrity and they were indeed true Christians and actually followed the teachings of Jesus, they wouldn't need an RRT because the whole thing would be just what they were.
Well, exactly. They would be bringing families together for Christmas.
Yeah.
Which is they say that it's their ideal. Well, I say go for it. Let's do it.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think also when you look at their focus on women's shelters and women in crisis, it points out the way they treat women inside there.
Absolutely. So that's what I was commenting before, is that the contours of RRTs, you can follow their campaigns and you can see where Bruce feels he's vulnerable.
Exactly.
And we have the late... Yeah, go ahead.
Go on.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, no, I was just going to say, that's interesting, that particular comment there. So effectively, RRT's focus is almost exclusively on the areas where the brethren's abuses are the most severe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. We have a latest recording of, I actually don't even know what they called it. There was this big, huge global Zoom call here this week.
Strive 23.
What was it called?
Strive 23.
Yeah, where they're trying to increase their profit 5 times in 2023 or something like that. Anyhow, we got a recording of it was Dean Hales, right? It was Dean Hales who's talking about how thankful he is for the sisters and how important they are in their ecosystem. And I'm like, who relates to women being a part of a Christian group as an ecosystem? Like, I sat there listening to this thing thinking, my heart just broke for every one of those single females in there because they don't know any better. And yet literally they're being buttered up by this man who's referring to them as an ecosystem.
Animals.
Literally animals. And if that
what kind of a misogynist thinks he has control over whether or not women should be in the ecosystem? That's my question.
And the other thing that was striking is that they were saying that they want every woman over the age of 18 needs to volunteer to work at the Campus & Co supermarkets. And unpaid labor is just a classic cult tactic. All cults have unpaid labor. And apparently that the reason for this is it would help them with their mental health.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, yeah, see, that's actually proving to be a significant... there's a similar cultic group here in New Zealand called Gloria Vale. You may have seen of it. They actually live in a commune. And a lot of their business activities are now being frozen out of their customers because it turns out that they've been using a lot of unpaid labour or very poorly paid labour, very similar to what the brethren do. And are doing. It's pretty striking if you've got a recording of that statement. But RRT is exactly the same. I went to, I think I volunteered for RRT twice, maybe. I was not a fan. But there was kind of pressure to come along. And there was I standing at this feeding sausages to some local frigging whatever it was, and I didn't actually. I thought this was hypocritical. I didn't want to be there.
Yeah, but the fascinating thing is that both in the UK, I believe, and Australia, the RRT got caught out because it turned out that about half the money they take in were actually being used to pay management wages. So the RRT management was getting a very fat wage out of charity money, and then they got caught out in this, and then they had to go over and and make all their management volunteers, which means they just pay them through some other back route. But you may not have been aware of it while you were serving.
I don't know about. I mean, I think that's important. That's important too. But what I would like to do is somehow find out how to become a contractor as a videographer for RRT. I believe there's significant money to be made there, and I've still got to pay for my private jet.
Yes. Yes, apparently if a cameraman from any news company turns up at one of their operations, they're all kind of instructed to parade in front of the camera and suddenly become very over-friendly and
but they do their own videos.
RRT jackets, like peacock.
The RRT Global Newswire is the latest thing. There's a huge amount of branding. There is a bit of a difficulty. Obviously, marketing is something that I keep an eye on and I sort of enjoy. There's the difficulty that RRT is it's being branded heavily, and that brand is being established. But in order to establish that brand with the way that it has, is that it's had to be entirely disassociated with the Plymouth Brethren or Exclusive Brethren brands. And so a great deal of its goodwill is extremely difficult for them to leverage. You get these awkward situations where I think I saw it was a response to Jessie Shedden, some article which referred to her, and the church was desperately trying to associate themselves with RRT, whereas most of the time they are trying to distance themselves from RRT so that they don't, because the Exclusive Brethren are like an albatross around RRT's neck.
Yeah, particularly in New Zealand, where they
try and keep them separate, but then when they want the goodwill, they have to try and tie them together, but that then poisons the brand, so then they have to, it's very difficult because it's essentially hypocritical. Yeah. They can't tie RRT in. So there's no RRT by PBCC, which, a normal church does that. They've got,
print, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what they do is in their public, when they're out on site, it just says RRT, but then they get the video and they get the photos and they publish them on the PBCC website, and there suddenly, this is a wonderful example of PBCC compassion. But when they're out facing the public, they kind of keep that very, very low key, because otherwise someone might come and tell them they're a bunch of cultists.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know who the other good job that they would have as the person that gets to sit and delete comments on their social media posts. You've got to work hard, long hours, but I imagine that it's 3 shifts, 8 hours each, 24/7.
Well, they probably have to have a set of replacement delete buttons on their laptop because they wear them out,
Yep. Yeah, look, it's all, as I said to you earlier, all of this stuff, it's not normal. It's not okay to have to delete comments on your Facebook posts like you're a freaking presidential candidate or this is odd. And it should be, the people that are having to do with RRT should be thinking, it's not that this stuff is all hidden. You can look it up. You can look up why they were set up. And if there's a tentacle hanging out of a bed, hanging out from underneath the bed, you don't get in the bed or move the bed or look under the bed. You just back quietly out of the room, right? It's a moral lesson from horror movies, one of many profound moral lessons they contain. In RRT's case, there's 3 tentacles and a couple of severed limbs lying on the floor, and yet these people. Legitimate charities are like, that's fine. Just ignore the putrid smell. Your bed is comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably better than backing out. You could go in with a flamethrower, couldn't you?
Well, you can. That's the other alternative. For the actual monster, yes. For the RRT, I think that their sausages are perfectly well done as it is. Thank you.
The other tentacle I'd like to point out, and this is speculative, but in the UK, as you know, I think 52 different Brethren companies scooped the bulk of the COVID contracts, sort of a 3.2 billion win.
Yeah,
now,
it was about think it was about 5% of the UK's COVID stimulus, which is a significant chunk for 0.0005% of the population. And yes, that is definitely that's a severed limb, to be honest. That's not just a tentacle. There's something really weird going on there.
Yes, and I like internal organs as well. But my point is
I like Boris Johnson. Okay, so I will say this here. I like Boris Johnson's spirit and the character and the humour of the man. I do not think he had, he was a very easily exploitable man because he was completely away with the fairies. And in terms of, he was thinking of sort of Greek and Latin phrases for the next thing that he was going to try and say. And that was wonderful, but he really, really allowed corruption to happen under his watch with the COVID situation. And I find it.
I don't know what happened with those contracts, and obviously there was some backhanders and there was dirty dealing with the Conservatives. But I'm just looking ahead. So now you've got 52 brethren companies who are all on the NHS's approved supplier list. Now, when NHS gets back to normal and starts putting out competitive contracts rather than single source contracts, they might send out a contract 3 or 4 ways to 3 or 4 different companies. But the chances are that all those companies will actually be owned by Plymouth Brethren. Now, are those contracts going to be truly competitive, or is there going to be a price fixing going on? Because it's actually in print in ministry that to compete with another Brethren company would be a test of fellowship.
That's the trouble with the whole situation, is that there's but people talk about the corporate veil, right? So you're not supposed. The courts sometimes pierce the corporate veil, which means to look through the ownership, to pierce through the behaviour of a corporation to look at the people that own it and their interests and their. And effectively, with the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, is that there's a religious veil, and the authorities are very, very reluctant to pierce that veil and look at who, in many cases and in many places, Brethren entities work together in a cartel-like way. That's very, very common.
Yes, exactly.
But they are protected, unlike most cartels, they are protected by that religious veil. And the courts and the legal systems are very, very reluctant. They currently have no real framework to look beyond, at the internal structure of the Plymouth Brethren and the flow of wealth, of influence, of control that actually all leads back to one place.
Yeah.
So just in the same way as the Brethren claim. Sorry.
The authorities sorry. You go.
The Brethren claim that each assembly is autonomous, and this is, one of their completely false claims they make, that each local assembly operates autonomously. So if something bad happens in one local assembly, you can't blame that on Mr. Bruce. You can't blame it on the global leadership. So in exactly the same way, they claim that each of the Brethren businesses is autonomous. Well, in reality, all of those Brethren businesses under UBT operate as a single non-competitive entity and manipulate the market to make sure that they have effectively as much of a cartel or as much of a monopoly as they can possibly get, which gives them particular advantage when they're bidding for competitive government contracts, because the chances are the government is going to be buying from the Brethren regardless of which of the 3 companies they choose to take for the bid.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to. I'm not, familiar with the situation in the UK. Every industry and every market's got its own circumstances, and some are more competitive than others. Some are, some are not competitive. It's markets are very organic, right? So they're not something that. Sometimes behaviour can look like cartels and it's not, and sometimes it can not look like cartel behaviour and it is. I don't know. I would have thought, as far as the NHS goes, I would have thought they had a fairly diverse supplier network. They do have, they're a very large purchaser of equipment, surely. They're a single source buyer. and I would have thought they had fairly good systems in place to ensure that they are not being taken for a ride. But it is the kind of thing that I certainly know it would fit a certain playbook that I'm familiar with to arrange that kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at the very least, buyers should be aware of the brethren link between certain companies. I mean, they should
one of the things that I actually find
companies,
one of the things that I would like to highlight, and I think is really curious, interesting about the COVID contracts, and particularly telling, is the way that, of course, the Guardian investigation discovered that some of the Unispace healthcare products, which of course Unispace Healthcare was then renamed to Santé Group.
Yeah.
But so they were getting sourcing equipment, PPE that was being manufactured by North Korean slave labour.
Yes, I remember that.
That is really interesting. Because of course supply chains it testifies firstly to the way that they suddenly piled, with no expertise in the history in the industry, they suddenly piled into PPE, and so they weren't able to properly vet their supply chains. But more so, they may not have cared. Potentially it was, as the Guardian's report noted, they didn't know whether Unispace was aware that that's who they were paying.
Yeah.
But birds of a feather tend to flock together. Like, as again with the tentacle hanging out from under the bed. If that's what you see, and then you look under the bed, you will find it's not going to be a bunch of folded linen, motherhood, and apple pie under there. And
yes,
the fact that there's these PPE contracts which were just stank to high heaven, to be honest.
Yes.
And then it's just not a coincidence that the money is then going to North Korea to people who are working for nothing but rice, so that their money can be used by Mr. Kim Jong-un to build a nuclear bomb.
That's nice.
It's an incredibly direct set of, like, honestly, this is a freaking monster. This is a great big monster under the bed.
Yeah.
Boris Johnson's PPE money is building a nuclear bomb. Because, and the middleman is Bruce Hales.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Look to me. I'm just a simple man.
But isn't it true that every time you start digging into a PBCC scandal, the deeper you dig, the more you find? I mean, you never get to the bottom of it.
No.
And you end up with a kind of a cone-shaped hole. You started with a little excavation at the top, and the deeper you go, the wider it gets, until you could fit a couple of cathedrals and a Boeing 747 in there, and you've still got shit at the bottom.
No, yep.
Yeah, we should probably land this plane anyhow. And then
it's been a pleasure. It's been 2 hours of talk. That has been a pleasure to catch up. We will. I think we've covered a bit of ground. I will have look.
Part two.
Yes, I will. When we get this plane landed, I will get my lawyer to cast an eye over it. But I think it's about time that some of these things started being said.
Yeah.
There's the Ronald Reagan once spoke about an old lady at the Blitz in the UK in London, and her house had been bombed, and the only possession that the rescuers were able to pull out from the wreckage was a bottle of whiskey. And they tried to get the old lady to take a swig of the bottle of whiskey, and she said, no, that's for emergencies. Reagan told that story in Parliament, and I think in Westminster in about 1981, referring to the Soviet Union, in terms of there was all of these resources, these stories, these things that people know, and are sitting in plain sight, and we're not using them because it's kind of for emergencies.
They're for emergencies.
This is the emergency. It's time to start talking.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, Braden.
Pleasure.
We will be back again. Take care.
Yeah.
To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me.